The autumn wind cut through the fabric of Clara Mitchell's worn traveling dress as she stepped down from the dusty stagecoach onto the wooden platform of Timber Ridge, Colorado. Her left sleeve carefully pinned and folded to conceal what wasn't. There, fluttered in the mountain breeze, the absence of her left arm from the elbow down had been her burden since childhood. But today it felt heavier than ever as curious eyes turned toward the lone woman passenger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara clutched her small leather satchel with her right hand, scanning the faces of the gathered townspeople for any sign of recognition. Someone should have been waiting for her. Thomas Whitmore had promised in his letters that he would meet every arriving coach until she came. Yet as the minutes ticked by and the other passengers dispersed to their waiting families or business associates, Clara found herself standing alone on the platform, the weight of uncertainty pressing down upon her shoulders like a heavy shawl. The journey from her hometown of Cedar Falls, Iowa, had taken the better part of a week. Every bone in her body ached from the constant jostling of the coach over rutted mountain roads, and her stomach churned from a combination of poor food and mounting anxiety about her future. She had left everything behind for this chance, a correspondence with a rancher who claimed he needed a wife willing to work hard and build a life in the Colorado Territory. Thomas Whitmore's advertisement had been different from the others she had seen in the newspaper. While most men sought young, beautiful wives with domestic skills, Thomas had written simply, seeking a woman of character and determination for partnership in ranch life. Physical beauty matters less than strength of spirit, must be prepared for the challenges of frontier living. When Clara had responded, explaining her condition honestly, she had braced herself for rejection. Instead, Thomas had written back, "A person's worth isn't measured by what they lack, but by what they bring to the table. If you're willing to work alongside me, I'm willing to learn alongside you." Those words had filled Clara with hope for the first time in years. In Cedar Falls, she had been the object of pity at best, cruel mockery at worst. The daughter of a blacksmith who had lost her arm in a mill accident at age 12, she had grown up watching potential suitors shy away from her disability. Her father, bless his soul, had tried to shield her from the worst of society's judgments, but even his protective love couldn't erase the whispered comments or the way men's eyes would fix on her pinned sleeve before they quickly looked away. When her father died of consumption the previous winter, Clara had found herself truly alone. Her mother had passed when Clara was still a child, and she had no siblings or close relatives willing to take her in. The small inheritance from her father's smithy had been enough to keep her housed and fed for a few months, but Cedar Falls offered limited opportunities for a woman, especially one with a visible disability. She had tried taking in laundry, but the physical demands proved challenging with only one arm. She had attempted to find work as a seamstress, but her output was slow compared to other women, and employers were reluctant to pay her a fair wage. It was desperation that had led her to scan the mail-order bride advertisements in the weekly paper. Most seemed impossibly demanding or clearly seeking something Clara could never provide. But Thomas Whitmore's simple, honest words had struck a chord in her heart. When she wrote to him, she had been completely forthright about her missing arm, expecting immediate rejection. Instead, his response had been kind, thoughtful, and surprisingly encouraging. "Miss Mitchell," he had written, "I've spent enough years on this ranch to know that what matters most is determination and a willingness to adapt. The mountains don't care if a person has 2 arms or 1. They care whether that person has the grit to survive and thrive. If you're willing to make this journey, I believe we can build something good together." Those letters had sustained Clara through the difficult weeks of preparation. selling her father's few remaining possessions and gathering the courage to leave the only home she had ever known. Thomas had sent money for her travel expenses and detailed instructions about the journey to Timber Ridge. He had promised to meet her at the station, to help her settle in, and to take things slowly as they got to know each other. But now, standing alone on the platform as the sun began its descent toward the jagged peaks surrounding the town, Clara felt the familiar sting of abandonment. Had Thomas seen her from a distance and changed his mind? Had he decided that a woman with one arm would be more of a burden than help on his ranch? The possibility made her stomach clench with both fear and anger. A gruff voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Miss, you looking for someone?" The station master, a weathered man with kind eyes beneath bushy grey eyebrows, approached with genuine concern. "Coach don't usually leave passengers standing here this long." Clara straightened her shoulders, determined not to show weakness, even as doubt gnawed at her confidence. "Yes, sir. I was to be met by Thomas Whitmore. He operates a ranch somewhere near here." The station master's expression shifted, and Clara's heart sank as she recognized the look, part sympathy, part uncomfortable knowledge. "Oh, miss, I'm real sorry to have to tell you this, but Tom Whitmore, well, he took ill about 3 weeks back. Fever got him bad. Dr. Harrison did what he could, but..." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Thomas was dead. The man who had offered her hope, who had seen past her disability to something worthy beneath, was gone. She felt her knees wobble slightly, but she forced herself to remain upright. "I see," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thing is," the station master continued, scratching his stubbled chin, "word around town was that Tom had been expecting someone. A lady friend, folks said. That must be you." Clara nodded numbly. We were to be married." The station master's weathered face creased with genuine sympathy. "I'm powerful sorry, miss. That's a hard thing to hear after such a long journey." He glanced at her small satchel and seemed to understand her predicament. "You got family back where you came from? Money for return passage?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Clara had spent nearly all her remaining funds on the one-way ticket to Colorado. She had burned her bridges in Cedar Falls, sold her father's shop to a man who made it clear she wouldn't be welcome to return, even if she had the money for passage. Back to Iowa, she would arrive with nothing, no home, no work, no prospects. "I'll manage," she said quietly, though she had no idea how. The station master studied her face for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Look, miss, there's a boarding house just down the main street. Mrs. Fletcher runs it. Decent woman, fair prices. Maybe you could stay there while you figure things out. And..." He hesitated, then continued. "There's been talk around town about what to do with Tom's place. Man didn't have a family, and the bank's been trying to sort out what happens to his ranch. Might be worth talking to them, seeing as how you were promised partnership." Clara felt a spark of something, not quite hope, but perhaps possibility. "Do you think they would listen to me?" "Can't hurt to try. Bank president's name is Harrison, same fellow who's the town doctor. Does both jobs, which tells you something about how small Timber Ridge is. He's a fair man, from what I've seen, as..." The station master gave her directions to both the boarding house and the bank. Clara tried to process this unexpected turn. Thomas was gone, taking with him her planned future, but perhaps there was still something to be salvaged from this disaster. At the very least, she could try to understand what had happened and whether there were any legal arrangements that might help her situation. The walk down Timber Ridge's main street was an exercise in composure. Clara kept her head high despite the curious stares that followed her. The town was smaller than Cedar Falls, with wooden storefronts lining a dusty main thoroughfare. Mountains loomed on all sides, their peaks already dusted with early snow, that promised a harsh winter ahead. The air was thin and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant smoke of cooking fires. Fletcher's boarding house proved to be a tidy two-story building with a hand-painted sign and lace curtains in the windows. Mrs. Fletcher herself answered Clara's knock, a middle-aged woman with greying hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp but not unkind eyes that immediately noticed Clara's pinned sleeve. "I need a room," Clara said simply. "The station master recommended your establishment." Mrs. Fletcher nodded. "Rates are 50 cents a night. Includes breakfast. You planning a long stay?" "I'm not sure yet. My circumstances are complicated." Something in Clara's tone must have conveyed her desperation, because Mrs. Fletcher's expression softened slightly. "Well, come in then. We'll start with one night and see how things develop." The room Mrs. Fletcher showed her was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the street. It was sparse but private, which was more than Clara had dared hope for. As she unpacked her few belongings, she found herself thinking about Thomas Whitmore, the man she would never meet, who had offered her a chance at a different life. His letters, carefully preserved in her satchel, painted a picture of a thoughtful, hard-working man who saw past society's superficial judgments. In one letter he had written, "I've learned that the mountains have a way of stripping away pretenses. Up here, what matters is whether you can contribute to the work that needs doing, whether you can face hardship without breaking, and whether you can find joy in simple things. I suspect you have all those qualities, Miss Mitchell, regardless of what others may have told you about your limitations." Those words had meant everything to Clara, coming as they did from a man who seemed to understand that her missing arm didn't define her worth. Now, with Thomas gone, she felt adrift again, but perhaps not entirely without options. The next morning, after a simple but filling breakfast of eggs and biscuits, Clara made her way to the building that housed both the bank and Dr. Harrison's practice. The doctor-banker proved to be a tall, thin man with intelligent eyes and a kind but busy manner. When Clara explained her situation, he listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small notes on a piece of paper. "Tom did mention expecting a lady," Dr. Harrison confirmed. "He seemed quite pleased about it, actually. Said he'd found someone who understood that ranch work was about problem-solving and determination, not just physical strength." Clara felt a bittersweet pang at hearing Thomas's words reflected back to her. "I was hoping there might be some legal arrangement, some way I could help settle his affairs, or perhaps..." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Harrison held up a hand gently. "Miss Mitchell, I appreciate your situation, and I wish I had better news. Tom's ranch reverts to the bank since he had no will and no family. However..." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "The property has been difficult to sell. It's remote, requires significant work, and frankly, most people who can afford a ranch aren't interested in the kind of isolation Tom's place offers." "What are you suggesting?" "Well, the bank needs to recoup what it can from the property. If someone were willing to take on the mortgage payments and the work required to maintain the place, we might be able to arrange something. It would be a significant responsibility, and the conditions would be challenging, especially heading into winter." Clara's heart began to race. "You would consider that? Even though I'm..." Dr. Harrison's expression became stern, but not unkind. "Miss Mitchell, I've been practicing medicine and running this bank for over 15 years. I've learned to judge people by their character and their determination, not by their physical characteristics. Tom spoke highly of your correspondence and your honesty about your situation. If you're truly prepared to take on such a challenge, I'm willing to discuss terms." The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. Clara would be alone on a remote ranch, facing a Colorado winter with only one arm and limited experience in frontier living. But it would be hers, a chance to prove herself, to build something with her own efforts. "I would like to see the property," she said quietly. Dr. Harrison nodded. "I can arrange that. Fair warning, though. It's a hard day's ride into the mountains, and the place has been empty for a month. It may not be what you're expecting." As Clara left the bank, her mind whirled with possibilities and fears. She had come to Timber Ridge expecting to marry a man she'd never met, to build a life based on letters and hope. Instead, she found herself contemplating something even more daunting, striking out entirely on her own in one of the most challenging environments imaginable. That afternoon, she explored the town more thoroughly, noting the general store, the blacksmith shop that reminded her painfully of her father, and the saloon where rough-looking men gathered to drink and play cards. Several people stared openly at her pinned sleeve, and she heard whispered conversations that clearly concerned her presence in town. At the general store, the proprietor, a nervous man named Jenkins, served her politely but coolly. When she inquired about supplies that might be needed for ranch living, his eyebrows rose skeptically. "Planning to stay in Timber Ridge long?" he asked. "Possibly," Clara replied evenly. "Mighty challenging country for someone." He gestured vaguely toward her missing arm. Clara met his gaze steadily. "I've found that challenges have a way of revealing what people are truly capable of." Jenkins seemed taken aback by her confident response, and Clara felt a small surge of satisfaction. She was tired of being underestimated, tired of being seen as someone to pity or dismiss. Whatever lay ahead in the mountains, she would face it with dignity and determination. That evening, as she sat in her small room listening to the sounds of the town settling into night, Clara thought about the choice before her. She could use her remaining money to return to Iowa, though she would arrive with nothing and no prospects. She could try to find work in Timber Ridge, though opportunities for a woman with a disability seemed limited. Or she could take the greatest risk of all, accepting responsibility for a remote mountain ranch and trying to make a life entirely on her own terms. The letters from Thomas Whitmore lay on her small table, and she read through them again by lamplight. In one, he had written, "I believe the frontier calls to people who have something to prove, either to the world or to themselves. Maybe both. There's something about this country that strips away everything except what really matters, and what really matters is what's inside a person." Clara folded the letters carefully and placed them back in her satchel. Tomorrow she would see Thomas Whitmore's ranch. She would look at the land he had chosen, the home he had built, and decide if she had the courage to claim a future that belonged entirely to her. Outside her window, the mountains loomed dark against a star-filled sky, their peaks disappearing into shadow. Somewhere up there, beyond the reach of town gossip and curious stares, lay a place where a woman might prove that her worth had nothing to do with missing pieces and everything to do with an unbroken spirit. Clara Mitchell had traveled 1,000 miles to escape her past and claim a future. Now, with that future transformed beyond recognition, she faced the most important decision of her life, whether to retreat to the familiar confines of a world that had never truly accepted her, or to venture into the unknown wilderness, where she might finally discover what she was truly capable of becoming. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mountain valleys as Clara Mitchell prepared for the journey to Thomas Whitmore's ranch. Dr. Harrison had arranged for a local guide named Pete Morrison to escort her to the property, a grizzled old prospector who knew every trail in the Colorado Territory and could navigate the treacherous mountain paths with his eyes closed. Pete arrived at Fletcher's boarding house just after dawn, leading 2 horses and a pack mule loaded with basic supplies. He was a compact man with weather-beaten skin and intelligent grey eyes that assessed Clara without judgment or pity. When he noticed her pinned sleeve, he simply nodded and moved on to practical matters. "Roads rough heading up to Whitmore's place," he said matter-of-factly. "Takes most of the day if we keep a steady pace. You ever ridden mountain trails before?" Clara shook her head. "I've ridden horses, but nothing like what I imagine we'll encounter today." Pete grunted approvingly. "Honest answer, I respect that. The mare I brought you is steady as granite and sure-footed as a mountain goat. She'll take care of you if you let her do her job." As they prepared to depart, Mrs. Fletcher appeared with a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Packed you some food for the journey," she said briskly. "And Miss Mitchell, well, I hope you find what you're looking for up there." The trail wound steadily upward from Timber Ridge, following a creek that sparkled in the morning light. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and crisper, carrying the sharp scent of pine and the distant promise of snow. Clara found herself breathing harder than usual, but she refused to complain or ask for rest stops she didn't absolutely need. Pete proved to be a surprisingly engaging companion. Despite his gruff exterior, he had a wealth of stories about the early days of the Colorado Territory, the mining boom that had brought thousands of fortune-seekers to the mountains, and the hardy souls who had chosen to stay and build lives. In this unforgiving landscape, Tom Whitmore was one of the good ones, Pete said, as they paused to rest the horses beside a mountain stream. "Came out here about 8 years ago, right after the big silver strike up in Leadville, but instead of chasing easy money in the mines, he wanted to build something lasting. Smart man, patient man, took him 3 years just to clear enough land for a decent garden." Clara listened intently, hungry for any details about the man whose letters had changed the course of her life. "What was he like? I mean, as a person?" Pete considered the question while their horses drank from the stream. "Quiet fellow, but not unfriendly. Came to town maybe once a month for supplies, always had time for a neighborly word. Helped folks when they needed it, never asked for anything in return." "I think—" Pete paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I think he was looking for someone who understood that building a life up here isn't about conquering the mountains. It's about learning to work with them." The observation struck Clara deeply. In his letters, Thomas had written about partnership, about finding someone who could adapt and contribute rather than simply endure. She wondered if she truly possessed the qualities he had believed he saw. In her correspondence, as they climbed higher, the landscape transformed dramatically. The gentler slopes near town gave way to steeper terrain, marked by dramatic rock formations and dense stands of aspen trees whose leaves flickered gold and copper in the autumn breeze. Occasionally, they passed abandoned mine shafts, or the remnants of prospectors' camps, ghostly reminders of dreams that had failed to materialize. "See that peak there?" Pete pointed to a particularly imposing summit that seemed to scrape the sky. "That's where old Jake Hendricks built his claim. Spent 6 years digging holes, convinced he was going to strike it rich. Never found so much as a flake of gold, but he wouldn't give up. Finally had to be carried down the mountain when the altitude and isolation got to him." Clara shuddered slightly, wondering if she was making a similar mistake, pursuing an impossible dream that would ultimately defeat her, but something in Pete's tone suggested he wasn't telling the story as a warning. "Thing is," Pete continued, "Jake's problem wasn't the mountains or the lack of gold. It was that he never learned to see what was actually there instead of what he wanted to be there. The mountains got plenty to offer, but only to folks who pay attention to what they're really dealing with." The wisdom in those words wasn't lost on Clara. She had spent too many years in Cedar Falls, being defined by what she lacked rather than what she possessed. Perhaps the mountains would offer her a chance to discover her actual capabilities, rather than society's assumptions about her limitations. By midday, they had climbed high enough that snow patches became visible in the shadowed ravines, and Clara could feel the bite of approaching winter in the wind. The trail had become little more than a deer path, winding through boulder fields and stands of pine so thick they blocked most of the sky. "We're getting close now," Pete announced as they crested a ridge that opened onto a spectacular vista. Tom's Valley is just beyond that stand of spruce trees. When they finally emerged into the clearing that held Thomas Whitmore's homestead, Clara felt her breath catch, not from the altitude, but from the unexpected beauty of the place. The ranch sat in a natural bowl surrounded by towering peaks, with a clear stream running along one edge and meadows that even in late autumn showed signs of careful cultivation. The cabin itself was larger than Clara had expected, a solid log structure with a stone chimney, covered porch, and several outbuildings, including a barn, storage shed, and what appeared to be a workshop. Everything showed signs of careful construction and maintenance, though a month of abandonment had allowed weeds to encroach on the garden and leaves to accumulate on the porch. "Tom built most of this himself," Pete said, noting Clara's amazement. "Took him the better part of 5 years, working mostly alone. Had to haul every piece of hardware up that trail we just traveled." Clara dismounted slowly, her legs unsteady after the long ride. She walked around the property methodically, trying to absorb every detail. The barn housed 2 milk cows that had been tended by neighbors since Thomas's death, along with a small flock of chickens and a vegetable garden that showed evidence of intelligent planning and patient cultivation. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable, with a large main room featuring a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a good stove, and 2 smaller rooms that served as bedroom and storage space. Everything was clean and well organized, reflecting the methodical mind of a man who understood that survival in such isolation required careful preparation and attention to detail. In the bedroom, Clara found a small writing desk where Thomas had clearly composed his letters to her. A few sheets of paper lay scattered across the surface, including what appeared to be a partially written letter with her name at the top. Her hands trembling slightly, she picked it up and read, "Dear Miss Mitchell, I hope your journey proceeds smoothly and that you find the mountains as beautiful as I have come to believe they are. I confess to some nervousness about your arrival, not because I doubt your capabilities, but because I want so much for this arrangement to succeed. I have spent too many years alone up here, and your letters have reminded me how much richer life becomes when shared with someone who understands." The letter ended there, unfinished. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she imagined Thomas struggling with fever while worrying about her impending arrival, perhaps trying to complete this letter even as his illness worsened. Pete appeared in the doorway, his expression gentle. "Found something?" Clara showed him the letter, and Pete nodded soberly. "Tom was a thoughtful man. I think he would be pleased knowing his place might help someone who needed it." They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the property more thoroughly. Clara was amazed by the infrastructure Thomas had created. A root cellar for food storage, a well-designed water system that brought mountain stream water directly to the cabin, and terraced fields that maximized the growing potential of the short mountain summer. "Could this really support someone through the winter?" Clara asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. "Tom did it for 8 years, Pete replied. Of course, he was experienced in mountain living, and he had time to build up his supplies and livestock gradually. Someone starting fresh would face bigger challenges. As evening approached, Pete built a fire in the cabin's fireplace while Clara prepared a simple meal from the supplies they had brought. The warmth and light transformed the empty cabin into something that felt almost like home, and Clara found herself imagining what it would be like to live here permanently. "Tell me honestly," she said as they ate their meal by firelight, "do you think it's possible? A woman like me taking on a place like this?" Pete chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Well, I won't lie to you, it would be hard. Mountain winters are brutal, and ranch work is demanding even for folks with all their limbs. But—" He paused, studying her face in the flickering light. I've seen plenty of people fail up here, and it's rarely because they weren't strong enough or fast enough. Usually it's because they couldn't adapt, couldn't learn new ways of doing things, or couldn't handle solitude. Clara considered this. And you think I might be able to? I think, Pete said slowly, that you've already spent your whole life adapting to challenges other folks can't even imagine. You figured out how to do things differently because you had to. That's exactly the kind of thinking that succeeds up here. That night, sleeping in Thomas Whitmore's bed for the first time, Clara lay awake, listening to the sounds of the mountain. Night, wind through the pines, the distant call of an owl, the gentle lowing of cattle in the barn. The silence was profound, almost overwhelming after a lifetime of town sounds. But it was also peaceful in a way she had never experienced. In the morning, Pete helped her conduct a more systematic inventory of the property's resources. The barn contained not only livestock, but also tools, harnesses, and equipment necessary for ranch operations. The root cellar was well stocked with preserved foods, and the workshop held everything needed for basic construction and repair work. Tom was a planner, Pete observed as they catalogued items. Man knew how to prepare for contingencies. Clara found herself thinking practically about the challenges ahead. The approaching winter would be her biggest immediate concern, but if she could survive until spring, she would have time to learn and adapt. The property had the basic infrastructure needed for self-sufficiency, and Thomas had clearly designed everything with careful attention to efficiency and sustainability. Pete, she said finally, if I decided to try this, would you be willing to help me get started? I could pay you for your time. Pete smiled for the first time since she'd met him. Miss Mitchell, I'd be happy to help you get settled. Tom was a friend, and I think he'd approve of what you're considering. On the ride back to Timber Ridge, Clara's mind was made up, though she kept her decision to herself until they arrived in town. The journey down the mountain gave her time to think through the practical implications of her choice. She would need to negotiate terms with Dr. Harrison, purchase additional supplies for winter, and somehow learn enough about ranch operations to keep herself and the livestock alive through the coming months. But for the first time since leaving Cedar Falls, Clara felt she was moving towards something rather than running away from it. The mountain ranch offered her a chance to build a life entirely on her own terms, free from the judgments and limitations that society had always imposed on her. When they arrived at Fletcher's boarding house that evening, Clara found Dr. Harrison waiting for her in the parlor. His expression was curious but not unsympathetic. Well, Miss Mitchell, what did you think of Tom's place? Clara straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze directly. I think it's exactly what I've been looking for. If you're still willing to discuss terms, I'd like to make an offer. Dr. Harrison smiled slightly. I was hoping you'd say that. Why? Don't we talk tomorrow morning at the bank? I think we can work something out that benefits everyone involved. As Clara prepared for bed that night, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror unlike anything she had ever experienced. Tomorrow, she would begin negotiations that could change her life forever. She would either become a property owner and independent rancher, or she would discover that her dreams were bigger than her capabilities. But tonight, for the first time in months, Clara Mitchell went to sleep knowing exactly where she wanted her life to lead. The mountains had shown her a vision of herself she had never dared imagine, not as a woman limited by her disability, but as someone capable of extraordinary things when given the chance to prove her worth. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Dr. Harrison's office as Clara Mitchell sat across from the banker physician, her heart hammering against her ribs. The stack of papers before them represented more than a business transaction. They were the keys to a future she had barely dared imagine just days before. Dr. Harrison adjusted his spectacles and reviewed the terms. They had spent 2 hours negotiating. So we agreed then. You'll assume responsibility for the mortgage payments, which come to $35 monthly. In exchange, you'll gain full ownership rights to the property, livestock, and improvements. The bank retains the right to foreclose if payments fall more than 60 days behind. But given the remote location and condition of the property, we're willing to be somewhat flexible during your first year as you establish operations. Clara nodded. Though the financial commitment terrified her, $35 monthly was more money than she had ever seen in her life, but Pete had assured her that the ranch could generate enough income through livestock and produce to meet the obligation if properly managed. There is one additional consideration, Dr. Harrison continued, his tone becoming more serious. Winter is approaching rapidly. If you're determined to take possession immediately, you'll need to prepare for several months of complete isolation. The trail we used yesterday becomes impassable once the heavy snows begin, usually by mid-November. You wouldn't see another soul until spring thaw, probably not until April or May. The prospect of spending 5 months entirely alone in the mountains was daunting, but Clara had already considered this challenge. I understand the risks, Dr. Harrison. I'd rather face them now than spend another winter dependent on others. Charity. Dr. Harrison studied her face for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. Very well, I'll have the papers drawn up this afternoon. You can take possession as soon as you're ready. Clara's hand trembled slightly as she signed the documents that made her a property owner for the first time in her life. The signature looked small and vulnerable on the official papers, but it represented a commitment that felt enormous. Pete. Morrison was waiting outside the bank when Clara emerged, having spent the morning purchasing supplies at Jenkins' General Store. His weathered face broke into a rare smile when he saw her expression. Judging by that look, I'd say congratulations are in order, Miss Mitchell. Mrs. Mitchell, actually, Clara corrected, then laughed at Pete's confused expression. I mean, I'm not married, but I'm a property owner now. Somehow that feels like it deserves a more formal address. Pete chuckled and tipped his hat. Well then, Mrs. Mitchell, we'd better get you moved up to your new home before the weather turns. I've got most of what you'll need loaded on the pack mules, but we should make one more trip to the store for winter provisions. The afternoon at Jenkins' General Store proved to be an education in frontier economics. Clara quickly discovered that everything cost significantly more than she had expected, and that her remaining cash would disappear alarmingly fast if she wasn't careful. Jenkins himself seemed skeptical about her ability to survive a mountain winter, and his doubt translated into reluctant service and inflated prices. Flour's 8 cents a pound, sugar's 12, he announced curtly. Coffee beans are 15 cents, but I'd recommend chicory instead, half the price, and lasts longer. Clara bit back her irritation at his condescending tone and focused on making practical decisions. Pete helped her calculate quantities needed for 5 months of isolation, and she was appalled to discover that food alone would consume nearly all her remaining money. Don't let Jenkins rattle you, Pete murmured as they loaded sacks of grain and beans onto the pack animals. Man's been trying to squeeze every cent out of folks since he opened that store. There are other ways to get supplies, especially once you're established up there. Clara raised an eyebrow questioningly, and Pete grinned. Trading, Mrs. Mitchell. Mountain folks have been bartering goods and services since before there was money in these parts. You've got livestock, you'll have eggs and milk, and Tom left you some fine tools. Come spring, you'll have currency that spends better than cash in some circles. The concept of trading rather than purchasing intrigued Clara. It suggested a different kind of economy, one based on practical value rather than arbitrary pricing. She filed the information away for future consideration. Their final stop was at the town's small post office, where Clara left a forwarding address and posted a letter to the only person in Cedar Falls who might wonder about her fate. Mrs. Pemberton, the elderly widow who had been her father's neighbor. "I have found an opportunity to establish myself independently," Clara wrote. "Please don't worry if you don't hear from me for several months. The mail service here is irregular, especially during winter. I am well and optimistic about my prospects." The Eid Saïd letter felt like a final severing of ties to her old life. When spring came, Clara Mitchell would either be a successful ranch owner or a cautionary tale, but she would no longer be the pitied invalid daughter of Cedar Falls' deceased blacksmith. They departed Timber Ridge just after dawn the following morning, leading a small caravan of pack animals loaded with supplies. Clara had spent her last night at Fletcher's boarding house saying goodbye to the closest thing she had to friends in Colorado. Mrs. Fletcher had surprised her with a jar of preserved peaches and some practical advice about mountain living. "Keep your fires banked at night," the older woman had instructed, "and don't be too proud to talk to yourself when the silence gets overwhelming. Isolation does strange things to a person's mind if you're not prepared for it." The journey back to the ranch felt different from Clara's exploratory trip. This time, she was traveling to her own property, carrying everything she owned in the world. The responsibility was sobering, but it was also exhilarating in a way she had never experienced. Pete proved to be an invaluable teacher during the 3-day process of getting Clara properly settled. He showed her how to bank fires for maximum efficiency, how to manage the livestock feeding schedule, and how to organize her food stores for easy access during blizzards. "The key to winter survival up here is routine," he explained as they arranged supplies in the root cellar. "You need to know exactly where everything is and how much you have left. When you're snowed in for weeks at a time, you can't afford to waste energy hunting for misplaced items." Clara listened intently to every piece of advice, taking notes in a small journal she had purchased in town. Pete taught her how to read weather signs in the mountains, how to recognize the difference between a passing storm and a dangerous blizzard, and how to prepare the cabin for extended periods of confinement. "See that wood pile Tom built?" Pete pointed to an enormous stack of split logs positioned near the cabin's back door. "That's not just for heating. You'll need wood for cooking, melting snow for water, and keeping the livestock areas warm enough to prevent freezing. Tom calculated that pile to last exactly 1 winter for 1 person. You'll need to be careful not to waste any." The mathematics of survival became a constant consideration. Clara found herself calculating everything in terms of resources and time, how many eggs the chickens would produce, how much milk the cows would give, how long her food supplies would last if stretched carefully. Pete also insisted on teaching Clara basic repairs and maintenance skills that she might need during her isolation. "Tom was handy with tools, but you'll need to be even more resourceful," he said, as he showed her how to patch holes in the cabin's chinked walls. "When something breaks up here in January, you can't just hire someone to fix it. You either fix it yourself or do without." Clara discovered that her missing arm, which had always been seen as a limitation, actually forced her to develop creative problem-solving skills that proved valuable in ranch work. She learned to brace boards with her body while driving nails, to use her teeth as a third hand when tying knots, and to leverage her weight and positioning to accomplish tasks that others might approach with brute strength. "You know what?" Pete observed, after watching her successfully repair a broken gate latch using an ingenious combination of wire and wooden wedges. "You might actually have some advantages up here. You've spent your whole life figuring out how to do things differently. Most folks who fail in the mountains fail because they keep trying to do things the same way they always have, even when it doesn't work anymore." On Pete's final day at the ranch, he helped Clara conduct a comprehensive inventory of her resources and establish a schedule for the coming winter. They counted livestock, measured food supplies, and calculated Clara's daily caloric needs for the months ahead. "You're in better shape than I expected," Pete concluded as they reviewed his calculations. Tom left you with a solid foundation, and you've shown good judgment about what to purchase. If you're careful and don't have any major disasters, you should come through your first winter just fine. Clara felt a surge of pride at his assessment, but also a growing awareness of how precarious her situation truly was. Everything depended on her ability to maintain the delicate balance Thomas had established, caring for livestock, managing food supplies, maintaining equipment, and keeping herself healthy through months of isolation. As Pete prepared to depart, he handed Clara a small leather pouch. "Emergency supplies," he explained. "Matches, fish hooks, some salt, and a few other things that could make the difference between life and death if everything else goes wrong. Tom asked me to put this together for him a few years back when he had a close call during a particularly bad storm." Clara accepted the pouch gratefully, understanding that it represented far more than emergency supplies. It was Pete's expression of confidence in her ability to survive and succeed. "I'll try to check on you come spring," Pete said as he mounted his horse. "But don't count on seeing another human being until the snow melts. If you need help before then, you'll have to provide it yourself." As Pete disappeared down the mountain trail, Clara experienced a moment of pure terror at the enormity of what she had undertaken. For the first time in her life, she was completely and utterly alone, responsible for her own survival in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. But the terror was accompanied by something else, a fierce pride in her independence and a determination to prove that Clara Mitchell was capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined. She had spent 26 years being defined by what she lacked. Now she would discover what she actually possessed. The first few days alone at the ranch established routines that would carry Clara through the winter. She rose before dawn to tend the livestock, milked the cows, collected eggs, and prepared meals with careful attention to nutritional balance and resource conservation. Evenings were devoted to maintenance tasks, mending clothes, repairing equipment, and studying the collection of books Thomas had accumulated. She discovered that he had been a voracious reader with interests ranging from agriculture and animal husbandry to philosophy and poetry. His marginalia revealed a thoughtful, questioning mind that Clara found herself responding to even in his absence. The work was demanding, but Clara found satisfaction in the rhythm of daily tasks and the tangible results of her efforts. When she repaired a broken fence rail or successfully treated a cow's minor injury, she felt a sense of accomplishment that her previous life had never provided. 10 days after Pete's departure, the first significant snowfall arrived. Clara woke to find the world outside her cabin transformed into a pristine white landscape that sparkled in the morning sun. The snow was beautiful, but it also represented the beginning of her true test. As she struggled to break ice on the livestock watering troughs and navigate the slippery paths between buildings, Clara realized that everything she had learned about wrench work would need to be modified for winter conditions. Simple tasks became complex challenges that required new techniques and careful planning. But each small victory, successfully feeding the animals despite the snow, maintaining adequate heat in the cabin, preparing nutritious meals from her limited stores, built Clara's confidence and reinforced her determination to prove herself capable of this demanding life. One evening, as she sat by the fire reading one of Thomas's books while snow pelted against the windows, Clara reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few weeks. She had traveled from Iowa as a rejected mail-order bride, expecting to build a life through dependence on a man she had never met. Instead, she had claimed her own property and was building a life through her own determination and resourcefulness. The transformation felt profound, almost mystical. The woman who had once sought acceptance through marriage to a stranger was becoming someone who needed no one's approval but her own. Clara Mitchell was discovering that her worth had never depended on others' opinions. It had always existed within her, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. As winter deepened and the snow began to pile higher around her cabin, Clara settled into the rhythm of mountain solitude with growing confidence. She was alone, but she was not helpless. She was challenged, but she was not defeated. For the first time in her life, Clara Mitchell was exactly where she belonged. The howling wind that had raged for 3 days finally subsided on a crisp December morning, leaving Clara's world transformed into a cathedral of snow and ice. Drifts reached nearly to the cabin's windows, and the path to the barn had completely disappeared under pristine white expanses that sparkled like diamonds in the pale winter sun. Clara had weathered her first major blizzard successfully, though not without challenges that tested every skill Pete Morrison had taught her. When the storm knocked down a section of the chicken coop's roof, she had worked for hours driving snow to create a temporary repair using canvas and rope. Her fingers had gone numb despite thick gloves, and she had fought exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her judgment. But the chickens had survived, the cabin had remained warm, and Clara had discovered reserves of determination she hadn't known she possessed. As she surveyed the snow-covered ranch that morning, she felt a quiet pride in her accomplishment. She had faced nature's fury and emerged victorious through preparation, resourcefulness, and sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. The isolation that Mrs. Fletcher had warned her about was beginning to affect Clara in unexpected ways. After weeks, without human conversation, she found herself talking aloud to the livestock, narrating her daily activities as if entertaining an invisible audience, and carrying on elaborate discussions with the photographs Thomas had left on his mantelpiece. "Well, Bessie," she said to the larger of her 2 cows as she performed the morning milking routine, "what do you think we should tackle today? The barn door is starting to stick again, and I noticed that loose board on the storage shed yesterday." Bessie responded with a patient moo that Clara chose to interpret as agreement with her priorities. The conversations with animals had started as a joke to combat loneliness, but Clara discovered they actually helped her think through problems and organize her tasks more effectively. More surprising was her growing relationship with Thomas Whitmore. Through the books, letters, and personal items he had left behind, reading his marginalia felt like engaging in intellectual discussions with a kindred spirit. His notes revealed a man who questioned conventional wisdom, sought creative solutions to practical problems, and possessed a dry sense of humor that Clara found increasingly appealing. In one agriculture manual, Thomas had written, "Eastern methods assume unlimited labor and resources. Mountain farming requires working smarter, not harder." The observation perfectly captured the approach Clara had been forced to develop in adapting ranch work to her physical limitations. She began writing her own responses to Thomas's notes, creating a strange but satisfying dialogue across time. With a man she would never meet, their conversations covered everything from livestock management to philosophy, and Clara found herself looking forward to these evening exchanges as much as she had once anticipated letters from living correspondents. January brought new challenges that tested Clara's resourcefulness in unexpected ways. A pack of wolves, driven down from higher elevations by harsh weather, began stalking her livestock. Clara first became aware of their presence when she found tracks in the snow around the barn and noticed that her cattle were unusually agitated. Traditional wisdom would have suggested shooting the wolves, but Clara faced 2 problems. She was still learning to handle firearms with one arm, and ammunition was precious enough that she couldn't afford to waste shots on uncertain targets. Instead, she developed a more creative solution. Using information from Thomas's hunting journals, Clara learned to read wolf behavior and anticipate their movements. She constructed noise-making devices from tin cans and string, positioned around the property's perimeter. More importantly, she began burning fires at strategic locations during the night, creating a barrier of light and scent that made the wolves uncomfortable without actually harming them. The strategy required exhausting vigilance for several weeks, but it ultimately proved effective. The wolves moved on to easier targets, leaving Clara's livestock unharmed and providing her with valuable lessons about coexistence rather than confrontation with mountain predators. Her success with the wolves boosted Clara's confidence dramatically. She had faced a serious threat to her livelihood and solved it through observation, creativity, and persistence rather than relying on brute force or traditional methods. The experience reinforced her growing belief that her disability had actually prepared her for frontier challenges by forcing her to develop innovative approaches to problem solving. February brought an unexpected visitor that would change Clara's understanding of her place in the mountain community. She was kindling behind the cabin when she heard the sound of approaching horses, a noise so foreign after months of solitude that she initially thought she was hallucinating. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their horses laboring through deep snow. As they drew closer, Clara recognized the lead rider as Dr. Harrison from Timber Ridge, though she couldn't imagine what would bring him to her remote ranch in the depths of winter. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Harrison called out as he dismounted near her cabin. "Thank God you're well. We weren't sure we'd find you alive." Clara set down her axe and studied the trio of visitors with curiosity and growing concern. Besides Dr. Harrison, the group included a young man she didn't recognize and an older fellow who appeared to be a guide or tracker. "What brings you all the way up here in this weather?" Clara asked, gesturing for them to follow her toward the cabin's warmth. Dr. Harrison's expression was grave as they settled around her fireplace. "We're looking for someone, and we hope you might have information that could help us. This is Marcus Webb," he indicated the younger man, "and his brother Daniel has been missing for nearly 2 months. Marcus Webb was perhaps 25 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of outdoor work." When he removed his hat, Clara noticed prematurely grey hair that suggested someone who had faced more than his share of hardships. "Daniel was trapping in the high country when the early storms hit in November," Marcus explained, his voice tight with worry. "He was supposed to return to our camp before Thanksgiving, but we never saw him again. We've been searching whenever the weather permitted, but the snow has made it nearly impossible." Clara felt a pang of sympathy for the obvious anguish in Marcus's voice. "I'm so sorry. I haven't seen anyone since Pete Morrison left in October, but I'd be happy to help however I can." Dr. Harrison spread a hand-drawn map on Clara's kitchen table. "Daniel was working in this area." He pointed to a region several miles north of Clara's ranch. "We thought perhaps he might have sought shelter somewhere nearby when the storms hit." Clara studied the map carefully, comparing it to her growing knowledge of the local terrain. "There are some old mining structures in that direction," she said slowly. "Abandoned cabins and mine shafts that someone might use for emergency shelter. I've seen smoke from that area once or twice, but I assumed it was other trappers or prospectors." Marcus leaned forward eagerly. "Could you show us where?" Clara hesitated, aware that guiding a search party would be dangerous and that she had limited experience with the terrain in question. But the desperate hope in Marcus's eyes reminded her of her own feelings when she had first arrived in Colorado, alone and vulnerable. "I can tell you what I've observed," she said carefully, "but I should warn you that I'm still learning this country myself." Over the next hour, Clara shared everything she knew about the surrounding area, marking locations on Marcus's map where she had noticed signs of human activity. Her information was fragmentary, but it provided the searchers with several new possibilities to investigate. As the men prepared to leave, Marcus turned to Clara with obvious gratitude. "Mrs. Mitchell, I can't thank you enough for your help. If there's ever anything I can do to repay your kindness—" "Just find your brother," Clara replied simply. After the searchers departed, Clara found herself deeply affected by the encounter. Marcus Webb's devotion to his missing brother reminded her of the importance of human connections she had been learning to live without. More troubling, she realized how much she had enjoyed having company after months of solitude. That evening, she wrote extensively in the journal she had begun keeping, reflecting on the strange mixture of independence and loneliness that characterized her new life. "I have proven I can survive alone," she wrote, "but surviving and truly living may be different things entirely." The search party returned 3 days later with Daniel Webb, alive but badly injured from a fall that had trapped him in an abandoned mineshaft for weeks. Clara watched from her cabin porch as the group passed by, noting the profound relief on Marcus's face as he rode beside a travois carrying his rescued brother. Marcus stopped briefly to thank Clara again and to update her on Daniel's condition. "He'll recover fully," the doctor says, "though it will take time. We found him exactly where you suggested we look, in that old mining camp north of here." As Clara watched the rescue party disappear down the mountain trail, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was genuinely happy that Daniel Webb had been found alive, and proud that her information had contributed to his rescue. But she was also acutely aware of how much she had enjoyed the brief human contact, and how empty her cabin felt now that she was alone again. March brought signs that her first winter isolation was beginning to end. The days grew noticeably longer, and Clara could detect subtle changes in the snow that suggested eventual melting. She began making lists of tasks she wanted to accomplish when spring weather made outdoor work possible again. Her livestock had survived the winter in excellent condition, proof that her care and management had been effective. The cattle were healthy and pregnant, promising to increase her herd. The chickens had continued laying throughout the cold months, providing Clara with fresh eggs that had supplemented her diet and prevented nutritional deficiencies. Most importantly, Clara herself had not merely survived, but thrived during her months of isolation. She had gained weight and muscle tone from the physical demands of ranch work. Her complexion had cleared from the clean mountain air and healthy diet, and her confidence had grown immeasurably. One evening in late March, as Clara sat by her fire, reading one of Thomas's philosophy books, she realized that the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Timber Ridge 6 months earlier no longer existed. That woman had been defined by her limitations, shaped by others' expectations, and dependent on external validation for her sense of worth. The woman Clara had become was someone entirely different. She was physically strong, mentally resilient, and emotionally independent. She had faced down wolves, survived blizzards, and managed a complex operation entirely through her own efforts. Her missing arm, once a source of shame and limitation, had become simply one characteristic among many, no more defining than her brown hair or her preference for coffee over tea. As she prepared for bed that night, Clara found herself wondering what challenges and opportunities the coming spring would bring. She had proven she could survive in the mountains, but she was beginning to understand that survival was only the foundation for something larger. The ranch was finally beginning to feel like home rather than simply refuge. Clara was no longer hiding from her past or running toward an uncertain future. She was building something permanent, something that reflected her own values and capabilities rather than society's expectations or limitations. When she lay down, in Thomas Whitmore's bed, which she had begun thinking of as her own bed, Clara felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. She had asked the mountains to test her worth, and she had passed every trial they had presented. Spring would bring new challenges, but it would also bring opportunities to expand her world beyond mere survival. Clara Mitchell had discovered who she truly was when stripped of everything except her own resources and determination. Now, she was ready to discover what she might become when given the chance to grow and thrive. The first hint of trouble came with the spring thaw in early April, when Clara discovered that the winter runoff had damaged the creek bank that supplied water to her ranch. What had been a gentle stream flowing past her property had become a torrential cascade that threatened to wash away the carefully constructed irrigation channels Thomas Whitmore had built over years of patient work. Clara stood at the edge of the swollen creek, watching helplessly as muddy water carved new channels through her pasture land. The wooden flume that directed water to her livestock troughs had been completely destroyed, and without a reliable water source, her ranch would become uninhabitable within days. The enormity of the crisis overwhelmed her initially. Rebuilding the water system would require heavy construction work that seemed impossible for someone with one arm, especially working alone. The spring planting season was approaching rapidly, and without irrigation, her vegetable garden would fail. Worse, if she couldn't provide adequate water for her livestock, she would be forced to sell them at devastating losses or watch them die. But as Clara studied the problem more carefully, she began to see possibilities rather than just obstacles. The flood had actually revealed the underlying rock structure of the creek bed, showing her why Thomas had chosen this particular location for his water system. More importantly, the rushing water had carved a natural channel that could be redirected with the right approach. Over the next week, Clara threw herself into the most demanding physical work she had ever attempted. Using techniques Pete Morrison had taught her about leverage and positioning, she began moving rocks and fallen logs to create a temporary dam that would slow the water's flow and reduce erosion. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. Clara had to wade into the icy creek while maneuvering heavy stones, using her body weight and careful balance to position materials where traditional lifting would have been impossible. Several times she nearly lost her footing in the rushing water, which could have swept her downstream to serious injury or death. But gradually, her improvised engineering began to show results. The makeshift dam created a pool that slowed the water's destructive force, and Clara was able to dig new channels that directed the flow where she needed it. The reconstruction wouldn't be as elegant as Thomas's original system, but it would function adequately until she could make permanent improvements. Just as Clara was beginning to feel confident about her progress, a new crisis emerged that would test her in ways she had never anticipated. Marcus Webb arrived at her ranch on a cold morning in late April, riding hard and obviously distressed. "Mrs. Mitchell," he called out as he dismounted near her cabin, "I need your help desperately. Daniel's taken a turn for the worse, and Dr. Harrison is stuck in Denver with a medical emergency. You're the only person within 50 miles who might be able to help." Clara wiped muddy hands on her work clothes and studied Marcus's anxious face. "What's wrong with Daniel?" "I'm not a doctor, Mr. Webb. He developed an infection from his injuries, and it's spreading fast. The fever's so high he's delirious, and—" Marcus's voice broke slightly. "I think he might be dying. Dr. Harrison left some medical supplies and instructions before he departed for Denver, but I don't know enough to use them properly." Clara felt her stomach clench with fear and uncertainty. She had no medical training beyond basic first aid, and attempting to treat a seriously ill person could be disastrous. But the desperation in Marcus's eyes reminded her of her own vulnerability when she had first arrived in Colorado, and she couldn't bear the thought of refusing help to someone who needed it. "Where is Daniel now?" she asked, already moving toward her cabin to gather supplies. At our cabin, about an hour's ride north of here. I've been trying to keep him cool and get liquids into him, but he's getting worse by the hour. Clara quickly assembled everything she thought might be useful: clean cloths, herbs from her medical kit, and the few pharmaceutical supplies she had purchased in Timber Ridge. Her heart hammered with anxiety as she saddled her horse, knowing that she was about to face a situation that could result in tragedy regardless of her efforts. The Webb brothers' cabin was a modest but well-built structure nestled in a grove of aspens near a small meadow. Marcus led Clara inside, where she found Daniel Webb burning with fever and mumbling incoherently. The young man was clearly in serious condition, and Clara felt overwhelmed by the responsibility Marcus was placing on her shoulders. "Show me what Dr. Harrison left," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm despite her inner turmoil. Marcus produced a leather medical bag containing various bottles, instruments, and a detailed letter of instructions written in Dr. Harrison's careful handwriting. Clara read through the doctor's notes carefully, trying to understand his recommendations for treating infection and managing dangerous fevers. The instructions were complex and assumed medical knowledge Clara didn't possess, but she forced herself to focus on the essential elements. Dr. Harrison had left specific medications and detailed dosages, along with warnings about symptoms that would indicate when to increase or decrease treatment. "Marcus," Clara said after studying the materials, "I'll do everything I can to help Daniel, but you need to understand that I'm not qualified for this." "If I make a mistake, you're his only chance," Marcus replied simply. "I trust your judgment more than my own ignorance." Over the next 3 days, Clara barely left Daniel's bedside. She followed Dr. Harrison's instructions meticulously, administering medications at precise intervals and monitoring Daniel's symptoms for any changes. The fever raged for 2 days before finally beginning to break, leaving Daniel weak but lucid. Clara's relief was overwhelming when Daniel's eyes finally focused on her face with recognition rather than delirium. "You must be the lady who helped." "Marcus, find me," he said weakly. "I owe you my life twice over now." But Clara's ordeal was far from finished. During her absence from the ranch, a late spring storm had brought heavy rains that threatened to wash away her temporary repairs to the water system. When she finally returned home after ensuring Daniel was out of immediate danger, she found her property partially flooded and her livestock in distress. The next week became a desperate race against time as Clara worked to rebuild her water management system while dealing with the aftermath of the flood. Mud and debris had clogged her irrigation channels, several fence sections had been damaged by fallen trees, and her vegetable garden had been completely destroyed by standing water. Most discouraging, Clara realized that her food supplies were running dangerously low. She had planned to supplement her remaining winter stores with early spring vegetables, but the flood had made gardening impossible until the soil dried and could be reworked. Unless she could find alternative food sources, she would face serious nutritional deficiencies that could threaten her health and ability to work. The crisis forced Clara to acknowledge how precarious her situation truly was. She had proven she could survive and even thrive under normal circumstances, but a series of interconnected disasters had pushed her to the limits of her resources and capabilities. For the first time since taking over the ranch, Clara seriously questioned whether she was attempting something beyond her abilities. The turning point came when Marcus Webb arrived unexpectedly with his brother Daniel, who was still weak but determined to help Clara in return for her medical assistance. "We heard about the flood damage," Marcus explained as they surveyed Clara's property. "Daniel insisted on coming to help, even though he should probably still be resting." Daniel, despite his recent illness, proved to have extensive experience with water management and construction techniques that Clara desperately needed. More importantly, the brothers brought supplies and equipment that made complex repairs possible. The key is working with the water flow instead of trying to fight it, Daniel explained, as they planned a new approach to Clara's irrigation system. Thomas had the right idea, but he built for normal conditions. We need to design something that can handle floods like this one. Over the following weeks, the three of them worked together to create a more robust water system that incorporated lessons learned from the recent disaster. Clara contributed her growing knowledge of the land and her innovative problem-solving skills, while the Webb brothers provided physical strength and technical expertise she couldn't manage alone. The collaboration revealed Clara's remarkable ability to adapt and lead despite her physical limitations. She found herself naturally organizing the work, making decisions about priorities and methods, and developing creative solutions to complex engineering problems. Her missing arm, which might have been seen as a handicap in traditional construction work, forced her to think more carefully about leverage, efficiency, and safety. "You know," Marcus observed one evening as they reviewed their progress, "you're probably the most naturally gifted project manager I've ever worked with. You see the whole picture in a way that most people don't." Clara felt a flush of pride at the compliment, but also a growing awareness that her talents extended far beyond simple survival. She was discovering leadership abilities and technical skills she had never been allowed to develop in her previous life. The reconstruction project also revealed the depth of friendship that was developing between Clara and the Webb brothers. What had begun as emergency assistance was evolving into genuine mutual respect and affection. Marcus, in particular, seemed drawn to Clara's combination of intelligence, determination, and practical competence. "I've never met anyone quite like you," Marcus told Clara one evening as they sat on her cabin porch, exhausted from a long day of construction work. "You face every challenge head-on, but you never lose sight of what's really important." Clara felt her heart flutter at the admiration in Marcus's voice, but she was also cautious about reading too much into his words. She had learned to value her independence, and she was wary of relationships that might compromise the hard-won autonomy she had achieved. "I've had to learn to rely on myself," she replied carefully. "When you can't depend on others' help, you discover capabilities you never knew you had." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "But there's a difference between self-reliance and isolation. Some challenges are meant to be shared." The observation lingered in Clara's mind as she considered the lessons of recent weeks. The crisis had tested her individual capabilities to their limits, but it had also demonstrated the power of cooperation and mutual support. She had saved Daniel's life through her medical care, but the brothers had saved her ranch through their construction expertise. Perhaps true strength wasn't about proving she needed no one, but about building relationships based on mutual respect and reciprocal contribution. Clara had spent months learning to survive alone, but the flood and its aftermath had taught her about thriving through selective collaboration with people who valued her for what she could contribute rather than pitying her for what she lacked. As spring progressed and the new water system proved its effectiveness, Clara found herself facing a decision that would shape her future in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had proven her capability as an independent ranch owner, but she was also discovering the possibility of building something even larger through partnership with others who shared her values and vision. The mountain test that had begun with her arrival in Colorado was evolving into something more complex and potentially more rewarding than simple survival. Clara Mitchell was learning that true strength sometimes meant knowing when to stand alone and when to accept the help of those who saw her clearly and valued her truly. The late summer sun cast golden light across Clara's thriving ranch as she stood in her reconstructed garden, harvesting vegetables that exceeded anything Thomas Whitmore had ever achieved on the property. The crisis of spring had ultimately led to innovations that made her operation more productive and resilient than it had ever been before. The new water management system, designed collaboratively with the Webb brothers, not only handled flood conditions, but also maximized irrigation efficiency during dry periods. Clara's careful attention to soil improvement and crop rotation had resulted in yields that amazed even experienced local farmers. Most significantly, she had discovered a talent for selective breeding that was producing livestock superior to anything in the surrounding territory. But the transformation went far beyond agricultural success. Clara Mitchell had evolved from a woman seeking refuge from society's judgments into someone who commanded genuine respect throughout the Colorado Territory. Her reputation for innovative problem-solving, reliable character, and generous assistance to neighbors had spread far beyond the immediate mountain community. The morning that would change everything began like any other, with Clara tending to her animals and reviewing the day's priorities. She was examining a promising young calf when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching her ranch. Looking up, she saw a sight that made her heart skip. Marcus Webb was leading a group that included his brother Daniel, Dr. Harrison, and several other men she recognized from Timber Ridge. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Harrison called out as the group dismounted near her cabin. "We hope you'll forgive this unannounced visit, but we have a proposition that couldn't wait for a more convenient time." Clara wiped her hands on her work apron and studied the serious faces of her visitors. Marcus met her eyes with an expression that combined nervousness and hope in equal measure, suggesting that whatever had brought them here was personally significant. To him, "Please come inside," Clara said, leading them toward her cabin. "I'll put on coffee and we can discuss whatever's on your minds." As the men settled around her kitchen table, Clara noticed the formal atmosphere that seemed to surround their visit. Dr. Harrison carried a leather portfolio filled with official-looking documents, and even Daniel Webb, usually relaxed and cheerful, appeared unusually serious. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Harrison began, opening his portfolio, "the territorial government has been reviewing applications for a new county seat in this region. The existing arrangement, with administrative offices scattered across 3 different towns, has proven inadequate for the growing population and economic development." Clara poured coffee and listened intently, uncertain where this discussion was leading, but sensing its importance from the men's demeanor. "The committee has identified this valley as the optimal location for a new county seat," Dr. Harrison continued. "The central location, water resources, and transportation accessibility make it ideal for supporting the government offices, courthouse, and related infrastructure that would be required." Clara felt her stomach tighten as she began to understand the implications. "Are you saying the territorial government wants to claim my ranch for public use?" "Not exactly," Marcus interjected quickly. "What we're proposing is a partnership. The territory would purchase a portion of your land at a generous price, but more importantly, we want you to serve as the primary contractor for developing the new administrative center." The suggestion left Clara momentarily speechless. She had never imagined herself involved in large-scale construction or government contracts, but the men around her table were clearly serious about their proposal. Dr. Harrison spread maps and architectural plans across the table. "Based on your work with the water management system and your demonstrated project management abilities, the Territorial Planning Committee believes you're uniquely qualified to oversee this development. The project would require someone who understands both the technical challenges of mountain construction and the practical needs of frontier communities." Clara studied the detailed plans, her mind racing as she absorbed the scope of what they were proposing. The new county seat would include a courthouse, administrative offices, a post office, and supporting businesses that would transform her isolated mountain valley into a bustling center of territorial government. "This would change everything," she said quietly. "The entire character of this place would be different." "Yes," Marcus agreed, "but it would also secure your financial future and establish you as one of the most important contractors in the territory. The committee is prepared to offer very favorable terms, including a percentage of ongoing revenue from businesses that locate here because of the infrastructure you would create." Daniel Webb leaned forward earnestly. "Clara, you've already proven you can turn disasters into opportunities. The flood that nearly destroyed your ranch became the foundation for improvements that made it more successful than ever. This project would operate on the same principle, but on a much larger scale." Clara walked to her window and gazed out at the peaceful valley that had become her sanctuary. The prospect of transforming it into a government center was both exhilarating and terrifying. She would gain financial security and professional recognition beyond anything she had dared imagine. But she would also lose the solitude and simplicity that had allowed her to discover her true capabilities. "What role would I actually play in this development?" she asked, turning back to face her visitors. Dr. Harrison consulted his notes. "You would serve as primary contractor for all construction, with authority to hire and manage subcontractors as needed. You would also have significant input into the design and layout of facilities, ensuring they meet the practical needs of mountain communities. Essentially, you would be building a town from the ground up." The magnitude of the opportunity was staggering. Clara would go from managing a single ranch to overseeing the creation of an entire municipal center. The financial rewards would be substantial, but more importantly, the project would establish her as a respected professional whose opinions and decisions would shape the development of the entire region. But even as Clara considered the professional aspects of the proposal, she was acutely aware of Marcus Webb's intense attention to her. Response. His nervous energy suggested that his interest in the project went beyond business considerations. "There's something else we need to discuss," Marcus said, his voice uncertain for the first time since Clara had known him. "The committee's offer assumes that you would have partners to help manage a project of this scope. They're specifically interested in having local residents involved who understand mountain conditions and community needs." Clara raised an eyebrow questioningly. "What kind of partners?" Marcus exchanged glances with his brother before continuing. "Daniel and I have been discussing the possibility of relocating our operation to this valley permanently. We could provide the additional manpower and expertise needed for large-scale construction, while you would maintain overall project management and decision-making authority." The suggestion hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond business arrangements. Clara could see in Marcus's eyes that he was proposing more than just a professional partnership, though he was being careful not to pressure her with personal declarations. "That's a significant decision for both of you," Clara said carefully. "Your current trapping and guiding operation is well established. Moving here would represent a major life change." Daniel Webb grinned and spoke up. "To be honest, Clara, we've been talking about transitioning away from trapping for a while now. The territory is getting more settled, and there's less demand for our traditional services. Construction and land development represent much better long-term prospects." Dr. Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps you'd like some time to consider all aspects of this proposal? The committee doesn't need a final answer immediately, but they would appreciate a response within a few weeks." Clara nodded gratefully. "I would definitely need time to think through all the implications. This is far more complex than anything I've ever contemplated." As the group prepared to depart, Marcus lingered behind while the others walked toward their horses. Clara could sense that he wanted to say something personal, but was struggling with how to express himself appropriately. "Clara," he said finally, "I want you to know that my interest in this project isn't just professional. I mean, the business opportunity is legitimate, and I think we could build something remarkable together. But I also—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I've never met anyone like you. Your strength, your intelligence, the way you approach challenges. I find myself thinking about you constantly." Clara felt her heart rate increase as Marcus voiced what she had begun to suspect. "About his feelings. Marcus, I appreciate your honesty, but I need to be equally direct with you. I've worked very hard to build an independent life here. I'm not sure I'm ready to complicate that with personal relationships." Marcus nodded, though Clara could see disappointment in his eyes. "I understand, and I respect your position completely. But I hope you'll consider that some complications are worth the risk, especially when they involve people who value and support each other's goals." That evening, after her visitors had departed, Clara found herself unable to focus on her usual routine. The proposal they had presented would fundamentally alter every aspect of her life, potentially offering her opportunities she had never dreamed possible, while also requiring her to abandon the simplicity and solitude that had enabled her transformation. The following days, Clara threw herself into careful analysis of the Territorial Committee's offer. She studied the financial projections, reviewed the architectural plans, and assessed the practical challenges involved in such large-scale construction. The more she examined the proposal, the more convinced she became that it represented a genuine opportunity rather than an unrealistic dream. But the business aspects of the decision were only part of what Clara needed to consider. Marcus Webb's personal interest added a dimension that forced her to examine her own feelings and priorities. She had spent more than a year proving that she could succeed independently, but that success had also left her increasingly aware of the limitations of pure self-reliance. Clara's relationship with the Webb brothers had demonstrated that collaboration with the right people could amplify her capabilities rather than diminish them. Marcus, in particular, had consistently treated her as an equal partner whose opinions and decisions were respected and valued. Unlike the men in her past who had seen her missing arm as a limitation, Marcus seemed to view her disability as simply one characteristic among many, neither more nor less significant than any other aspect of her personality. The transformation that had brought Clara from rejected mail-order bride to successful ranch owner was impressive, but she was beginning to understand that it might only be the foundation for something even more significant. The Territorial Committee's proposal offered her the chance to build something that would benefit entire communities while establishing her as a respected professional whose work would shape the region's development for decades to come. 3 weeks after the committee's visit, Clara made her decision. She saddled her horse and rode down to the Webb brothers' cabin, where she found Marcus working on equipment repairs, while Daniel organized their trapping supplies. "I've reached a decision about the territorial project," Clara announced without preamble. "I'm accepting their offer with some modifications to the terms I'd like to negotiate." Marcus looked up from his work, his face brightening with excitement and relief. "That's wonderful news, Clara. What kind of modifications are you considering?" Clara dismounted and walked closer to where the brothers were working. "I want to structure the partnership so that we maintain equal decision-making authority over all aspects of the project. I've learned that my best work comes from collaboration with people who respect my judgment, not from arrangements where I'm subordinate to others' directions." Daniel nodded approvingly. "That makes perfect sense. We've seen how you approach problems, and frankly, we'd be foolish not to give your insights equal weight with our own." Clara felt a flutter of nervousness as she prepared to address the personal dimension of Marcus's interest. There's also the matter of how we structure our working relationship. Marcus, you've been clear about your personal feelings, and I want you to know that I'm not indifferent to them, but I need our professional partnership to be established and successful before we explore anything personal. Marcus's smile was understanding and patient. I completely agree. Building trust and respect through our work together is the best foundation for any deeper relationship that might develop naturally. As Clara rode back to her ranch that evening, she felt a profound sense of anticipation about the future. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Timber Ridge more than a year ago had been seeking someone else to define her value and provide her security. The woman she had become was ready to create value and security, not just for herself, but for entire communities that would benefit from her work. Clara Mitchell had discovered that her worth had never depended on others' approval or on conforming to society's narrow definitions of capability. Her missing arm, once a source of shame and limitation, had become the catalyst for developing innovative approaches to problem-solving that were now in demand throughout the territory. Most importantly, she had learned that true strength came, not from proving she needed no one, but from building relationships with people who valued her contributions and supported her goals. The territorial project would test those lessons on the largest scale she had ever attempted, but Clara was confident that the transformation she had undergone had prepared her for whatever challenges lay ahead. 2 years after accepting the territorial contract, Clara Mitchell stood on the covered porch of the newly completed courthouse, watching as the morning sun illuminated the bustling town that had grown around her vision. Whitmore Springs, named in honor of Thomas Whitmore, whose original homestead had become the foundation for this thriving community, bore little resemblance to the isolated mountain valley where Clara had once struggled simply to survive. The main street stretched for nearly a quarter mile, lined with businesses that served not only the county government, but also the growing population of settlers, merchants, and entrepreneurs drawn by the opportunities Clara's development had created. The Grand Mountain Hotel, built to accommodate visiting officials and traveling businessmen, featured the finest accommodations between Denver and the California border. Henderson's General Mercantile carried goods from across the continent, while the Frontier Bank and Trust managed financial transactions for the entire region. But Clara's proudest achievement wasn't visible in the impressive buildings or commercial success. It was the revolutionary approach to construction and community planning that had made Whitmore Springs a model for territorial development throughout the American West. Every structure incorporated innovations Clara had developed to accommodate workers with various physical limitations, proving that inclusive design created better outcomes for everyone. The courthouse itself exemplified Clara's philosophy. Wide hallways accommodated wheelchairs and crutches, adjustable height work surfaces allowed people of different sizes and abilities to function effectively, and clever architectural features eliminated the need for excessive physical strength. In daily operations, visitors from other territories came specifically to study these innovations, which were being copied in government buildings across the frontier. Marcus Webb emerged from the courthouse carrying a thick portfolio of contracts and architectural drawings. His role as Clara's primary business partner had evolved into something much more significant over the preceding months, though they had maintained their agreement to let their professional relationship develop before exploring personal feelings. The Territorial Governor's Office just confirmed our contract for the new mining district courthouse, Marcus announced, his voice bright with excitement. They specifically requested that we incorporate the accessibility features we developed here. Apparently, word about our innovations has reached Washington. Clara felt a familiar surge of satisfaction at recognition of their work's broader impact. Which features are they most interested in implementing? All of them, actually. The adjustable work surfaces, the ramp systems, the modified door handles, everything we've pioneered here. They're also asking us to train their construction crews in inclusive building techniques. The request represented validation of Clara's belief that addressing her own limitations had led to discoveries that benefited entire communities. The techniques she had developed out of necessity were becoming standard practices that improved accessibility and functionality for everyone. Daniel Webb appeared from behind the courthouse, leading a crew of workers who were installing the final decorative elements on the building's exterior. His recovery from the infection that had nearly killed him 2 years earlier had been complete, and he had become Clara's most trusted construction foreman. "Mrs. Mitchell," Daniel called out, removing his hat respectfully, "we're ready for your final inspection of the stonework. I think you'll be pleased with how the mountain granite turned out." Clara followed Daniel around the building, examining the carefully crafted stone facades that incorporated local materials with innovative construction techniques. The courthouse would serve the community for generations, but it would also stand as a testament to what could be achieved when limitations became the foundation for creative solutions. As they completed their inspection, Clara noticed a familiar figure approaching from the direction of the train station. Pete Morrison, now considerably greyer but still vigorous, was leading a horse and carrying the leather satchel that indicated he was delivering mail and news from distant locations. "Mrs. Mitchell," Pete called out cheerfully, "got a letter here that's been chasing you from Denver to Colorado Springs and back again. Looks important, judging by all the official seals." Clara accepted the heavy envelope with curiosity, noting the elaborate letterhead of the United States Department of the Interior. As she read the formal language, her eyes widened with amazement. "What is it?" Marcus asked, noting her expression. "It's an invitation to serve on a federal commission for territorial development," Clara said slowly, still processing the implications. "They want me to help establish building standards and accessibility requirements for all new government construction in the Western Territories." The letter represented recognition at the highest levels of government, but it also meant extensive travel and months away from Whitmore Springs. Clara felt torn between pride in the opportunity and reluctance to leave the community she had worked so hard to build. "That's an incredible honor," Marcus said, though Clara detected a note of concern in his voice. "When would this commission work begin?" "According to this, they want me in Washington by the 1st of next year for initial planning sessions. The work would involve traveling to various territorial capitals and training local officials in the new construction standards." Pete Morrison, who had been listening to the conversation with interest, offered his perspective. "Sounds like the kind of work that could influence building practices for decades to come. Tom Whitmore would be mighty proud to know his homestead became the starting point for something that reaches clear to Washington." That evening, Clara found herself walking through the town she had created, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from rejected mail-order bride to federal consultant. Every building, every street, every successful business represented challenges overcome and innovations developed through necessity and determination. She paused at the small cemetery where Thomas Whitmore was buried, his grave marked by a simple stone that read, "Thomas Whitmore, 1825 to 1873, visionary and pioneer." Clara had commissioned the memorial after learning more about Thomas's background from his letters and personal papers. He had been a Civil War veteran who came west seeking peace and purpose, much as Clara had sought refuge from society's judgments. "Thank you," Clara said quietly to the headstone. "Your letters gave me hope when I needed it most. And your ranch became the foundation for everything that followed. I hope what we've built here honors your vision." As Clara walked back toward her expanded cabin, which now served as both residence and business headquarters, she found Marcus waiting on her porch with 2 cups of coffee and a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about your federal commission. Opportunity," he said, as she joined him on the porch swing they had installed the previous spring. "I think you should accept it." Clara looked at him with surprise. "Even though it would mean months of separation and uncertainty about when I could return?" Marcus nodded, though she could see the personal cost the decision represented for him. "Clara, what you've accomplished here is remarkable, but it's also just the beginning. The techniques you've developed could improve lives throughout the country, but only if you're willing to share them beyond our little valley." Clara studied Marcus's face in the lamplight, recognizing the struggle between his personal desires and his genuine support for her professional growth. "What about a partnership, the projects we've planned?" "Daniel and I can handle the local construction contracts," Marcus replied. "And you'll be back regularly for consultations and project reviews. More importantly, the federal commission work will establish your reputation nationally. When you return permanently, you'll be able to choose whatever projects interest you most." The conversation continued late into the night as Clara and Marcus discussed the practical and personal implications of the federal opportunity. What emerged was a plan that would allow Clara to serve on the commission while maintaining her connection to Whitmore Springs and her partnership with the Webb brothers. 3 months later, Clara found herself standing in the marble corridors of the Department of the Interior building in Washington, D.C., carrying the same small leather satchel she had brought to Colorado years earlier. But everything else about her situation had changed dramatically. She was no longer seeking opportunity. She was creating it. The other commission members, all experienced architects and engineers, treated her as an equal, whose opinions carried significant weight in their deliberations. Her innovations in accessible design were being incorporated into federal building standards that would influence construction throughout the rapidly expanding nation. During her weeks in Washington, Clara received invitations to speak at engineering conferences, requests for consultation on major construction projects, and offers to establish permanent practices in eastern cities. The recognition was gratifying, but it also confirmed her appreciation for the life she had built in Colorado. The territories offered possibilities for innovation and community building that simply didn't exist in established eastern cities. More importantly, her work in Whitmore Springs had demonstrated that addressing limitations and challenges often led to solutions that benefited everyone, not just those with specific needs. Clara's most significant presentation to the Federal Commission focused on the economic benefits of inclusive design. Using data from Whitmore Springs, she demonstrated that accessibility features typically added less than 5% to construction costs while increasing building functionality and community satisfaction dramatically. "Gentlemen," Clara addressed the commission during her final presentation, "accessible design isn't charity, it's smart business. Communities that welcome and accommodate all residents attract more settlers, more businesses, and more economic development. The initial investment in inclusive construction pays dividends for generations." The commission unanimously adopted Clara's recommendations, establishing accessibility standards that would influence federal construction for decades. But even more satisfying was the personal recognition she received from Commission Chairman Senator William Hayes, who publicly credited Clara with revolutionizing government approaches to public building design. When Clara returned to Whitmore Springs 6 months later, she found a community that had continued growing and prospering. Under Marcus and Daniel's management, the railroad had extended service to their valley, bringing new opportunities for commerce and communication with distant markets. Marcus met her at the train station with a bouquet of wildflowers and news about developments during her absence. "The hotel has been booked solid for 3 months," he reported as they walked toward the courthouse. "Apparently, our reputation for innovative construction has made us a destination for architects and planners from across the country." Clara felt deep satisfaction at hearing about the community's continued success, but she was also struck by how much she had missed the daily rhythm of life in her mountain valley. The federal commission work had been professionally rewarding, but Whitmore Springs felt like home in ways that no other place ever could. That evening, as Clara and Marcus sat on the courthouse steps, watching the sunset paint the surrounding peaks in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Marcus raised the personal question they had carefully avoided addressing for more than 2 years. "Clara," he said quietly, "I know we agreed to let our professional relationship develop before exploring personal feelings, but I think we've proven that we work well together. I'm wondering if you might be willing to consider taking our partnership in a more personal direction." Clara had been expecting this conversation, and she had spent considerable time during her travels thinking about her feelings for Marcus Webb. "I've been wondering the same thing," she admitted. "You've been patient and supportive in ways I never experienced before, but I need you to understand that I'll never be a traditional wife who subordinates her career to domestic concerns." Marcus smiled and took her hand gently. "Clara, I fell in love with your strength, your intelligence, and your determination to build something meaningful with your life. I would never want you to become someone different from the woman I admire so deeply." 6 months later, Clara Mitchell and Marcus Webb were married in a ceremony held on the courthouse steps, surrounded by the community they had built together. Pete Morrison served as officiant, having obtained the authority to perform marriages through his appointment as territorial justice of the peace. The wedding celebration reflected the inclusive spirit that characterized everything about Whitmore Springs. Guests included territorial officials, local ranchers, business owners, construction workers, and families from throughout the region who had been touched by Clara's innovations and community vision. Dr. Harrison, now serving as mayor of the expanded town, offered a toast that captured the significance of Clara's transformation. "To Clara Mitchell Webb, who came to our territory seeking a new beginning and instead gave all of us a vision of what communities can become when we value everyone's contributions." As Clara and Marcus established their household in the expanded ranch house that now overlooked the thriving town, Clara reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from rejected mail-order bride to respected community leader and federal consultant. Her missing arm, once a source of shame and limitation, had become the catalyst for innovations that were improving lives throughout the American frontier. The isolation and challenges that had initially threatened to overwhelm her had instead revealed capabilities she never could have discovered in more conventional circumstances. Most importantly, Clara had learned that true love and respect came not from conforming to others' expectations, but from finding people who valued her authentic self and supported her aspirations. Marcus had proven that partnership could enhance rather than diminish individual achievement when built on mutual respect and shared vision. Years later, when historians studied the development of the American West, they would identify Clara Mitchell Webb as one of the pioneering figures who demonstrated that physical limitations need not prevent extraordinary achievement. The accessible design principles she developed became standard practice throughout the territories, improving countless lives and proving that addressing challenges often led to innovations that benefited entire communities. But Clara's greatest legacy wasn't recorded in history books or government reports. It lived in the thriving community of Whitmore Springs, where children grew up believing that everyone had valuable contributions to make, regardless of their physical characteristics, and where innovation born from necessity continued to solve problems and create opportunities for generations of residents. The woman who had once stepped off a stagecoach carrying nothing but hope and determination had built something far greater than she had ever dared imagine. Not just a successful business or a thriving town, but a demonstration that the human spirit could transform any limitation into the foundation for extraordinary achievement. 5 years into their marriage, Clara and Marcus received news that would bring their story full circle in the most unexpected way. A young woman named Eleanor Patterson had written to Clara from Boston, explaining that she had read about Whitmore Springs in an Eastern newspaper and was seeking advice about her own situation. Eleanor's letter revealed circumstances remarkably similar to Clara's original predicament. She had lost her right leg in a factory accident and found herself rejected by potential suitors who saw her prosthetic limb as an insurmountable flaw. Like Clara years earlier, Eleanor was considering responding to mail-order bride advertisements as her only hope for building a life away from the constant judgment of Eastern society. "Mrs. Webb," Eleanor had written, "I have read about your remarkable achievements in Colorado, and I dare to hope that you might offer guidance to someone facing similar challenges. I am not seeking charity or pity, but rather the wisdom of someone who has proven that a woman's worth extends far beyond society's narrow definitions of perfection." Clara read the letter aloud to Marcus as they sat in their garden one evening, watching their twin daughters play among the flower beds Clara had designed using raised planting techniques that accommodated her one-armed gardening methods. "She reminds me of myself at that age," Clara mused, folding the letter carefully, desperate enough to risk everything on the possibility that somewhere, someone might see value in who she truly is, rather than focusing on what she lacks. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "What do you think you'll tell her?" Clara was quiet for several minutes, considering not just Eleanor's immediate situation, but the broader implications of her request. "I think I'll invite her here to see for herself what's possible when people refuse to be defined by others' limitations." The exchange of letters that followed revealed Eleanor Patterson to be an intelligent, determined young woman whose factory accident had ended her career as a seamstress, but had not diminished her spirit or her practical skills. Like Clara, Eleanor had been forced to develop creative solutions to everyday challenges, inadvertently building problem-solving abilities that could prove valuable in frontier life. When Eleanor arrived in Whitmore Springs 3 months later, Clara was struck by the familiar mixture of hope and terror she saw in the young woman's eyes. Eleanor stepped off the train with the same small satchel and uncertain expression that Clara remembered from her own arrival in Colorado years earlier. But Eleanor's experience in Whitmore Springs differed dramatically from Clara's original reception. In Timber Ridge, the community Clara had built welcomed newcomers based on their character and contributions rather than their physical characteristics. Within days, Eleanor found herself involved in meaningful work that utilized her skills and challenged her capabilities. Clara introduced Eleanor to Sarah Chen, a Chinese immigrant who had established Whitmore Springs' first tailoring shop despite facing both racial and gender discrimination in other communities. Sarah's success demonstrated that Clara's inclusive approach to community building extended beyond accommodating physical disabilities to embracing all forms of diversity. "Miss Patterson," Sarah explained, as she showed Eleanor around her well-equipped shop, "Mrs. Webb taught us that innovation often comes from people who must approach problems differently. Your experience adapting sewing techniques to work with a prosthetic leg might lead to improvements that benefit all seamstresses." Eleanor's eyes brightened as she examined Sarah's innovative workspace design, which incorporated many accessibility features Clara had pioneered. Adjustable work surfaces, specialized lighting, and ergonomic tool arrangements created an environment where people with various physical characteristics could work efficiently and comfortably. Over the following weeks, Eleanor blossomed in ways that reminded Clara of her own transformation. The young woman's natural talents for design and problem-solving emerged as she worked with Sarah to develop new tailoring techniques that accommodated both her prosthetic leg and the specific needs of frontier customers. More significantly, Eleanor attracted the respectful attention of James Morrison, Pete's younger brother, who had recently established a successful freight and transportation business, serving the expanding network of mountain communities. James's interest in Eleanor was clearly based on admiration for her intelligence and capabilities, rather than pity for her circumstances. "It's remarkable how history seems to be repeating itself," Marcus observed to Clara one evening as they watched Eleanor and James walking together through the town square. "Another strong woman finding her place in our community. Another good man recognizing value that others had overlooked." Clara smiled, remembering her own tentative first conversations with Marcus. "The difference is that Eleanor doesn't have to prove herself in isolation first. She's discovering her capabilities within a community that already values what she has to offer." The observation highlighted how fundamentally Clara had changed, not just her own circumstances, but the entire culture of opportunity available to others facing similar challenges. Whitmore Springs had become a place where limitations were viewed as starting points for innovation rather than barriers to contribution. Eleanor's success story spread beyond the immediate community, attracting other individuals who had been marginalized or dismissed by conventional society. A former cavalry officer who had lost his sight in an Indian raid became the town's most successful livestock trader, using his enhanced hearing and memory to detect qualities in animals that sighted evaluators missed. A widow with severe arthritis revolutionized the town's bakery operations by developing techniques that minimized hand strain while improving product quality. Each success reinforced Clara's understanding that addressing challenges often led to innovations that benefited entire communities. The principles she had discovered through necessity were becoming the foundation for a more inclusive and dynamic approach to frontier development. Clara's reputation as a community builder and accessibility expert continued to grow, bringing requests for consultation from territories throughout the American West. She developed a selective approach to these opportunities, accepting projects that allowed her to extend Whitmore Springs' inclusive model while maintaining her primary focus on her family and home community. One particularly meaningful project involved designing the accessibility features for the new territorial capitol building in Denver. Clara's recommendations went far beyond basic accommodation to create a government center that demonstrated how inclusive design could enhance functionality and dignity for all users. The Denver project brought Clara into contact with Territorial Governor Samuel Crawford, who had followed her work for several years. Governor Crawford offered Clara an appointment as Territorial Director of Public Works, a position that would have made her one of the most powerful women in Colorado government. "Mrs. Webb," Governor Crawford explained during their meeting in his temporary offices, "your innovations in community development and accessible design have attracted national attention. The federal government is preparing to establish new standards for territorial administration, and they want proven leaders to implement these changes." Clara felt honored by the recognition, but she was also clear about her priorities. "Governor Crawford, I appreciate the confidence you're placing in me, but I need to be honest about my limitations. I'm not interested in positions that would require me to relocate permanently or abandon the community work that defines my purpose. The governor smiled knowingly. Mrs. Webb, I wouldn't expect you to abandon Whitmore Springs. What I'm proposing is a consulting arrangement that would allow you to influence territorial policy while maintaining your base of operations in your own community. The arrangement Governor Crawford proposed would establish Clara as the territory's primary consultant on accessibility and inclusive development, with authority to review and approve all major public construction projects. The position would provide substantial income and influence while allowing her to remain in Whitmore Springs and continue her community building work. Clara accepted the appointment, marking another milestone in her evolution from rejected mail order, bride to territorial official. But perhaps more meaningful was the personal recognition the appointment represented. She was being chosen not despite her disability, but because her experience had led to innovations that benefited everyone. On the 10th anniversary of Clara's arrival in Colorado, the citizens of Whitmore Springs organized a celebration that drew visitors from throughout the territory. The event featured demonstrations of accessible construction techniques, exhibitions of adaptive technologies developed by local residents, and presentations by other communities that had adopted Whitmore Springs' inclusive development model. The celebration's highlight was the dedication of the Thomas Whitmore Memorial Library, funded by Clara and designed to serve as a repository for accessibility research and community development resources. The library would ensure that the innovations pioneered in Whitmore Springs would be preserved and shared with future generations. Dr. Harrison, now elderly but still serving as mayor, delivered the dedication address that captured the significance of Clara's transformation and legacy. 10 years ago, a young woman arrived in our territory carrying nothing but hope and determination. Today, we celebrate not just her personal success, but the demonstration that every person carries within them the potential for extraordinary contribution when given the opportunity to develop their unique capabilities. As Clara stood before the assembled crowd, holding her younger daughter while Marcus held their older child, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from desperation to fulfillment. The woman who had once feared that her missing arm made her unworthy of love had discovered that her greatest strength lay not in what she possessed, but in how she chose to use whatever she had been given. Eleanor Patterson, now married to James Morrison and establishing her own tailoring empire, approached Clara after the ceremony with a proposal that would extend their community's influence even further. Mrs. Webb, Eleanor said, I've been corresponding with women throughout the country who face circumstances similar to what we both experienced. I'd like to establish a formal program to bring qualified candidates to Whitmore Springs, not as charity cases, but as potential contributors to our community's continued growth. Clara's eyes lit up at the suggestion. A systematic approach to identifying and recruiting people whose limitations might actually be assets in the right environment? Exactly. We've proven that what society sees as disabilities often translate into innovative thinking and problem-solving abilities that communities need. Why not actively seek out those people instead of waiting for them to find us accidentally? The conversation that followed laid the groundwork for the Whitmore Springs Settlement Program, which would become a model for inclusive community development throughout the American frontier. The program would identify individuals whose challenges had forced them to develop exceptional adaptive skills, then provide them with opportunities to apply those skills in supportive environments. As the anniversary celebration continued into the evening, Clara found herself surrounded by the community she had helped create, a place where value was measured by contribution rather than conventional definitions of capability, where innovation emerged from addressing challenges rather than avoiding them, and where every person was encouraged to discover and develop their unique potential. Marcus found Clara sitting quietly on the courthouse steps as the celebration wound down, watching their daughters play with other children in the town, square that had once been empty wilderness. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling beside her on the steps where they had been married years earlier. Clara considered the question seriously, thinking about the conventional life she might have lived if she had never left Iowa, if she had never answered Thomas Whitmore's advertisement, if she had never taken the enormous risk of claiming an independent future in the Colorado mountains. "No regrets," she said finally. Everything that seemed like a disaster at the time, being abandoned at the train station, Thomas's death, the flood that nearly destroyed the ranch, all of it led to something better than anything I could have planned or imagined. Marcus nodded, understanding the deeper truth in her observation. "You didn't just build a successful community, Clara. You proved that strength comes from accepting yourself completely and then using whatever you have to create something meaningful." As they sat together in the gathering dusk, Clara Mitchell Webb understood that her story had become larger than her individual triumph. She had demonstrated that the human spirit could transform any limitation into the foundation for extraordinary achievement. But more importantly, she had created a place where others could make the same discovery about their own unlimited potential. The mail-order bride who had arrived with a missing arm had found far more than acceptance. She had found her true purpose in showing others that being perfect as you are meant recognizing that every limitation contained within it the seeds of innovation, strength, and unimaginable possibility. 3 years after the establishment of the Whitmore Springs Settlement Program, Clara received a letter that would challenge her understanding of her own legacy in ways she had never anticipated. The correspondence came from Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a physician from Philadelphia who had been following Clara's work through medical journals and territorial reports. "Mrs. Webb," Dr. Hartwell had written, "I am writing to inform you that your innovations in accessible design and adaptive community planning have captured the attention of the International Medical Congress. We would like to invite you to present your findings at our upcoming conference in Chicago, where physicians and researchers from around the world will gather to discuss advances in rehabilitation and adaptive medicine." The invitation represented recognition from the highest levels of the medical establishment, but it also presented Clara with a profound dilemma. The conference would require her to speak before hundreds of medical professionals, many of whom would view her primarily as a case study rather than as an expert whose insights had practical applications. Marcus found Clara in their study that evening, staring at Dr. Hartwell's letter with an expression that mixed pride with apprehension. "The medical conference invitation?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her desk. "I'm honored by the recognition," Clara said slowly. "But I'm also concerned about how they'll present my work. Will they focus on the innovations themselves, or will I become an inspirational exhibit for their theories about overcoming disability?" The question touched on Clara's deepest concerns about public recognition. She had worked hard to establish herself as a professional whose ideas had value, independent of her personal circumstances. The prospect of being presented primarily as an inspiring example of triumph over adversity felt like a step backward from the respect she had earned through actual achievement. "What does your instinct tell you?" Marcus asked. Clara was quiet for several minutes, considering not just the immediate opportunity, but its implications for how her work would be perceived and utilized by future generations. "I think I need to accept the invitation, but on my own terms. If I'm going to address medical professionals, I want to focus on the practical applications of inclusive design rather than on my personal story." The months of preparation for the Chicago Conference became an opportunity for Clara to synthesize years of experience into a comprehensive framework that could be applied in diverse settings. Working with Eleanor Patterson and other community members, she developed detailed documentation of the innovations that had emerged from Whitmore Springs, complete with cost-benefit analyses and implementation guidelines. The presentation, Clara, ultimately delivered in Chicago, became legendary in medical and architectural circles. Rather than focusing on her personal triumph over disability, she systematically demonstrated how addressing accessibility challenges had led to design improvements that benefited entire populations. Gentlemen, Clara addressed the assembled physicians and researchers, I stand before you today not as an inspirational example of overcoming limitation, but as a practitioner who has discovered that what we call disabilities are often simply different approaches to problem solving that can reveal solutions invisible to conventional thinking. Her presentation included detailed case studies from Whitmore Springs, showing how modifications designed for specific limitations had improved efficiency, safety, and usability for all residents. The adjustable work surfaces, originally created for her one-armed limitations, reduced back strain for everyone. The ramp systems designed for wheelchair access improved material handling throughout the community. The enhanced lighting installed for residents with vision challenges increased productivity in all work environments. The response from the medical community exceeded Clara's expectations. Rather than viewing her innovations as mere accommodations for disability, leading physicians recognized them as fundamental improvements in environmental design that could prevent injuries and enhance human performance across all populations. Dr. Hartwell approached Clara after her presentation with obvious excitement. Mrs. Webb, your work represents a paradigm shift in how we think about human adaptation and environmental design. Have you considered establishing a formal research institute to continue developing these concepts? The suggestion planted a seed that would grow into Clara's most ambitious project yet. Over the following year, she worked with territorial officials, federal representatives, and private benefactors to establish the Whitmore Institute for Adaptive Innovation, a research and training center dedicated to developing inclusive design principles that could be applied worldwide. The institute attracted researchers, architects, and community planners from across the globe, making Whitmore Springs an international destination for innovative thinking about human capability and environmental adaptation. But Clara insisted that the Institute remain grounded in practical application rather than theoretical research. We're not here to study disability, Clara explained to the Institute's first class of fellows. We're here to study innovation. How challenges can become catalysts for discoveries that benefit everyone. The Institute's first major project involved redesigning factory safety systems using principles Clara had developed through years of one-handed problem-solving. The resulting innovations reduced workplace injuries by 60% while increasing production efficiency, proving that accessible design could simultaneously improve safety and profitability. But perhaps the Institute's most significant contribution came through its community development program, which sent teams of researchers and planners to establish Whitmore Springs-style communities throughout the American frontier. Each new settlement adapted Clara's inclusive principles to local conditions and populations, creating a network of communities where innovation emerged from diversity rather than conformity. Eleanor Patterson, now serving as the Institute's Director of Community Outreach, led many of these development projects. Her work establishing inclusive communities in Nevada, Wyoming, and Oregon demonstrated that Clara's model could be successfully adapted to various geographical and economic conditions. Mrs. Webb's genius wasn't in overcoming her disability, Eleanor explained to a gathering of territorial governors. But in recognizing that what society calls limitations are often untapped resources for innovation, our job is to create environments where those resources can be discovered and developed. The success of the Institute network brought Clara to the attention of federal officials who were grappling with the challenges of rapid westward expansion. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad had accelerated settlement, but many new communities struggled with planning and development challenges that Clara's methods had proven capable of addressing. President Ulysses Grant personally invited Clara to serve as a special advisor on territorial development, a role that would involve working directly with federal agencies to establish planning standards for new settlements throughout the American West. Mrs. Webb, President Grant explained during their meeting in Washington, your work in Colorado has demonstrated that thoughtful community planning can accelerate development while ensuring that all citizens have opportunities to contribute. We need those insights applied on a national scale. Clara accepted the presidential appointment, but negotiated terms that allowed her to maintain her base in Whitmore Springs while influencing federal policy. The arrangement established her as one of the most influential women in American government, with authority over development standards that would shape hundreds of communities throughout the expanding nation. The scope of Clara's influence became apparent when the federal government adopted her accessibility standards as mandatory requirements for all new territorial construction. Post offices, courthouses, schools, and government buildings throughout the American West incorporated design elements that Clara had originally developed to accommodate her own limitations. More significantly, Clara's community development model became the template for federal settlement programs that encouraged diverse populations to participate in westward expansion. Rather than simply seeking able-bodied families, these programs actively recruited individuals whose challenges might translate into innovative approaches to frontier living. The results exceeded all expectations. Communities established using Clara's inclusive model showed higher retention rates, faster economic development, and more successful adaptation to frontier challenges than traditional settlements. The federal government's adoption of her methods accelerated westward expansion while ensuring that new territories developed in ways that maximized human potential regardless of individual characteristics. As Clara's influence expanded nationally, she never lost sight of the personal relationships and community connections that had made her success possible. She maintained close correspondence with residents of Whitmore Springs, regularly returned to participate in community decisions, and ensured that her daughters understood the values and principles that had guided their family's remarkable journey. Her twin daughters, Mary and Sarah, grew up in an environment where capability mattered more than conventional definitions of perfection. They witnessed daily examples of how challenges could become strengths when approached with creativity and determination. Both girls developed exceptional problem-solving skills and natural leadership abilities that reflected their mother's influence. Mary showed particular talent for engineering and design, often working alongside Clara on institute projects and demonstrating an intuitive understanding of how physical environments could be optimized for diverse users. Sarah gravitated toward community organization and social innovation, developing programs that helped new settlers adapt to frontier conditions regardless of their backgrounds or physical characteristics. The girls' development reinforced Clara's belief that growing up in environments that valued diversity and innovation created individuals better prepared to address complex challenges throughout their lives. They would carry forward not just Clara's specific insights about accessibility, but her fundamental understanding that limitations could become foundations for extraordinary achievement. On Clara's 20th anniversary in Colorado, the town of Whitmore Springs organized a celebration that brought together representatives from more than 50 communities that had been established using her development model. The gathering became an international conference on inclusive community planning, with attendees from Europe, Australia, and Canada coming to study methods that had originated in a remote mountain valley. The celebration's centerpiece was the dedication of the Clara Mitchell Webb Center for Innovation, a research facility that would continue developing and refining inclusive design principles for future generations. But Clara insisted that the building be named the Community Innovation Center, reflecting her belief that the insights attributed to her had actually emerged from collaborative work with hundreds of individuals who had contributed their own unique perspectives and experiences. During the dedication ceremony, Clara reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had brought her from desperate mail-order bride to internationally recognized expert whose work was shaping community development on multiple continents. But her greatest satisfaction came from knowing that the principles she had discovered would continue evolving through the work of others who shared her vision of human potential. 20 years ago, Clara told the assembled crowd, I arrived in this valley believing that my missing arm made me less valuable than other people. Today, I understand that my real limitation was accepting others' definitions of what I could accomplish. The innovations we celebrate today didn't come from overcoming disability. They came from refusing to accept that any human characteristic should limit what someone might contribute to their community. As Clara stood before representatives of communities throughout the world that had been influenced by her work, she understood that her story had become larger than any individual achievement. She had demonstrated that human worth couldn't be measured by conventional standards of physical capability, but more importantly, she had created systems and institutions that would continue proving that principle long after her own contributions had ended. The mail-order bride, who had stepped off a train in Colorado with nothing but hope and determination, had discovered that her true purpose wasn't just to succeed despite her limitations, but to prove that those limitations could become the foundation for innovations that would benefit countless others throughout history. In learning to see herself as perfect exactly as she was, Clara Mitchell Webb had shown the world that every human difference contained within it the potential for extraordinary contribution to the shared work of building better communities for all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.